Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our weekly briefing on preventing and managing COVID-19 in the workplace. Can you believe it? This is our 40th consecutive week of presenting this webinar, and we really appreciate your continued participation. Anyone who's joining us for the first time, welcome aboard. I'm sure you'll find it quite informative. This is Karen O'Hara. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications with WorkCare, and I'm the moderator for today's session. The session is being recorded, and you will be on mute during the webinar. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. At the conclusion of the formal presentation, we'll answer as many questions as we have time for. And as most of you know, we do post answers to all questions, including those we don't have time to address, on our website in writing every week. So you can find it on our COVID-19 page at workcare.com. We also post a recording of the webinar on our YouTube channel, and we post the links to both of those in the chat during the webinar. Our speaker today, and as always, is Anthony Harris, MD, MBA, MPH. Dr. Harris is board certified in occupational medicine. He's WorkCare's Chief Innovation Officer and Associate Medical Director for on-site clinical operations. He's also our lead clinician for WorkCare's COVID-19 response. Today he's going to be talking some more about the vaccine, following up on our topic from last week. There's lots of news in that realm, so I'll turn it right over to him. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here on our 40th occasion here of presenting this presentation. So we're super excited today. We're going to get right into it. You know the format if you're joining us again. If you have joined us for the first time, we'll go over the clinical update followed by some pathology, microbiology. We'll jump into the numbers as we look at macroscopically how the U.S. is doing, both domestic and abroad. And we'll also talk about our prevention, our strategies for the workforce as it pertains to recommendations from WorkCare. And with that, today we'll be focusing in on, yes, matters germane to the vaccine. Also, we'll be focusing in on what to do, what to message, and what may present in the workplace when we talk about interacting with your workforce and the vaccine availability, respectively. So with that, we're going to jump into our clinical update today. And normally I don't do this, okay? But today we're going to do a little bit of a shocker because we want to make sure that people understand clinical presentation to the fullest extent, but we also want to communicate matters that may cajole the both public as well as the workforce into hopefully receiving the vaccine when it's available. So today's clinical presentation, we haven't talked about it really before, but we're going to talk about it today briefly and expand upon it, is erectile dysfunction. Yes, erectile dysfunction being clinically documented, associated with COVID-19 infection for men. So what do we want to talk about in that regard? We want to talk about messaging, right? We have heard colloquialisms around COVID-19 having an effect on the male reproductive system, and many may have thought it was only rumored to have an association. But there is clinical evidence supporting the association of COVID-19 infection with erectile dysfunction. So let's get into what that looks like. Studies are now becoming more frequent that address this particular topic. In regards to this particular study, looking at a number of COVID-19 infections over a period of time starting back in the summer, researchers were able to evaluate what are some of the potential causes of erectile dysfunction as a result of a COVID-19 infection. And what these researchers found is that there is association from one, endothelial dysfunction. We'll break that down here shortly. And additional impact from subclinical hypogonadism. What is that? Hypogonadism is essentially poor functioning or less functioning reproductive organs, the testes in this case. There is some psychological distress that's attributed to the cause of COVID-19, as well as impaired pulmonary hypodynamics, meaning that the lungs aren't functioning normally, and that can contribute as well. Those individuals that also have cardiovascular conditions pre-existing may be at increased risk additionally for erectile dysfunction after a COVID-19 or with a COVID-19 infection. So there are key hallmarks here that we want to pay attention to and also prepare to communicate to our general public and to our workforce, because it will be important in terms of helping individuals fully understand that COVID-19, although the symptoms may appear to be mild or even asymptomatic from the cough and sneeze, the runny nose, and the fever aspect, there are still considerations that must be uh, prominent for individuals to fully understand the impact of a COVID-19 infection in normal, healthy adults otherwise. So let's talk about then the underlying pathology, not just for the erectile dysfunction, but also for the dysfunction that we see in other organs. And we'll point out and pull out some research that came out of the UK in their research and innovation, and we can simplify in this distillation some of the underlying pathology that we want individuals to understand at a high level, right? We're communicating pathology on a week-to-week basis to you all, the health and safety experts, right? Because we want to be able to equip you to answer questions as they come about amongst your workforce. And this is key in regards to understanding not just, again, erectile dysfunction causality, potential causality from COVID-19, but also other microvascular and cardiovascular effects from COVID-19. So let's start with the cascade, and we'll simplify this. I promise we won't make you immunologists. We talk about then the next step that causes this cascade to have an effect on blood vessels. We're speaking to the virus itself actually causing damage to the lining of the blood vessels. So the endothelial layer, which is just the cells that line the blood vessels, are impacted directly by the virus itself as well as the immune system. And so that's important to know in terms of its effects. And so that causes, in turn, platelets to aggregate. Platelets, as you may be familiar, are key in our clotting cascade to help us stop bleeding if we're cut in other situations, right? So these platelets become activated by this cascade, immunologic cascade, and that causes then blood clots to form. Our red blood cells begin to clot, and that obscures the blood vessel and the flow of blood, which then leads to damage to either the lungs in this case, as we're depicting, but also as these promulgate through propagate through the rest of the circulatory system, they have their effects on other end organs such as the kidneys, the liver, etc. So this is the cascade, and this is the mechanism thought to underline some of the risk for COVID-19 infections affecting male reproductive systems, both the testes and decreasing potentially testosterone, as well as erectile dysfunction. So again, we want to point this out in terms of our messaging, because we want to understand how to get through to employees and the general population on the importance of vaccination to prevent some of these untoward outcomes as a result of COVID-19 infection. So historically, we've seen a depiction of some in the popular media, a mask over a banana, and that represented mask up to help prevent erectile dysfunction. Now we want to message that with combination of get your vaccine so that this and other poor outcomes aren't a part of your experience if you become infected with COVID-19 or exposed to COVID-19 rather. So now let's look at some of the drastic numbers that you continue to see in the US. We'll start with the number of cases on a 7-day rolling average, 16.3 million cases as of today. If we look at that rate, we're up to 65.3 on an average daily case per 100,000. All right, and we're over now, we've just crested 300,000 deaths. If we look at the impact of deaths in the states most affected per population, we see that number now is 0.8 and per 100,000. and we see the states that are most deeply impacted. If we continue to draw back and look globally where we were 2 weeks ago with the daily 7-day rolling average for COVID cases, we see where we were in the US in comparison to others that we track along here, where we were last week and where we are this week. Unfortunately, continuing to see increasing numbers on a daily average, 7-day rolling average, in comparison to France. We want to point out France. We'll talk about France a little bit more here in a second, but hold that in your minds that we want to compare how we're doing versus our neighbors that have taken other measures and seen a result. We saw a decrease slightly when we talk about per million 2 weeks ago in the US. That number reversed and that trend reversed and started to increase last week, and we continue on that upward trend now. Again, now is a good time to point out what happened in France, what continues to happen in France as it compares to United Kingdom and Germany, who are also showing an increase after showing decreases in COVID-19. And so how are they doing it, right? Let's start asking questions around their social distancing practices, their curfews, et cetera. And let's see if we can hopefully mirror some of that success as we have lockdowns that are happening nationwide now because of the surge that we've been experiencing over the last couple weeks. If we look to deaths, obviously we know we've crested 300,000 deaths 2 weeks ago. This is a picture of where we were. Picture last week of how we increased in that 30-day lagging indicator and where we are today. If we look at deaths that follow in France as well, they're declining, and we'll continue to likely see that decline with their measures in place that they put in place several weeks ago. If we now do the deaths per population, then we see where the US lies in regards to the United Kingdom, to Germany, that are seeing sharp increases, and also seeing increases here in Canada. That was 2 weeks ago. This is where we were last week, and this is where we are this week. Again, France seeing that steady decline there. How are we doing on tests in the US? Again, when we show this statistic, we are optimistic that this number will grow and continue to grow. In practice, what we're seeing is this number oscillates. 2 weeks ago, we were at the 1.2 million. We continue to be at that number this past week, and we're just a little bit above that 1.4 million now at this point in time. So hopefully this number will continue to grow. We know there was a number of tests that were sequestered by the US government, in particular some point-of-care nucleic acid tests called Q Health that were making its way into the general population. Simple test looking for nucleic acid, and the results were in 20 minutes, and it can be done at home by individuals themselves. Unfortunately, they're on back order now, so we'll continue to look at new tests that come out, and we'll spend some time perhaps in the next week or two looking at and examining what new home tests are going to be burgeoning as we try to increase the number of tests total conducted in the US here. If we look at then tests per 100,000, we see this number again oscillating here in the US and declining a bit. Up and down is what we've seen for the last couple of weeks, and we'll continue to likely see that oscillation, but hopefully an overall general trend upward here. The share of positive tests continues to look grim, right? And we know this metric should be going down. It's going up dramatically. 2 weeks ago it was, last week it was, and this week it continues to go up. Whereas again, we look at France, they continue to go down in this particular metric, meaning that they're getting better at articulating the burden of illness. In France, we're getting worse at articulating the burden of illness in the US. So let's jump into our perspective on prevention, and let's talk about more vaccine-associated things that we want to consider, right? We're going to put on our economic hat or our economist hat, whether you're a Keynesian economist or not, right? We know the fundamentals about the economy is supply and demand. So we're going to frame our concept of the vaccine and how we are going to fare, hopefully, as the vaccine is distributed in the US through this lens of supply and demand. So on the supply side, Pfizer approved, obviously, last week And now we're moving forward with distribution here in the US. And what we find is that Pfizer, in the number of tests that are being, or number of vaccines that are being distributed, are far less than states anticipated. So let's look to some of the trends in regards to the politics around why the supply is not what states have initially thought to be. And we see that administration is happening first and foremost in healthcare facilities, that first tranche 1A in the scheme that was recommended by the CDC to roll out vaccinations. And when we look at then what may be holding us back from having a greater number of availability of the vaccine, we can see that early on, the US did not order or failed to order a high number of Pfizer vaccines. And when the administration, the Trump administration, recognized this, they began to try to negotiate for additional vaccines. And the response was that 100 million doses by the end of March is what is estimated, right? Enough to inoculate 50 million people. And if we look to then what numbers may be forthcoming, right? About 150 million people by the end of June is what's estimated. But that's still less than half of our US population. And we'll dig into the numbers even more so here shortly. The important thing to note that is when Pfizer was asked by the administration, can you get us 50 million more Americans vaccinated? Pfizer responded that it already had enough customers to take its supply out into the middle of next year, and we're not likely to be getting additional vaccines from Pfizer. So obviously we're going to look to Moderna getting hopefully EUA approved tomorrow on the 17th by FDA. If so, then we'll have more supply in regards to our vaccination efforts. But if we look on the demand side now, as we've explored this potential shortcomings or bottlenecks in the supply, the demand side looks a little bit more grim. And what do I mean by that? If we examine now what polls have said around, and these are polls that Pfizer and Moderna have done internally, as well as polls that we'll point to in a little bit here, done by the Associated Press and others, about 40% of Americans that responded to the poll said they did not plan to take the vaccine. In Texas, it was 42% said they would take the vaccine. And if we look to additional data around some of the stigma around the vaccine, we see that Black Americans, over half of them said they would not take the vaccine. In fact, only 25% responded and said they would take the vaccine. And some of the stigma goes back to the 1930s. If you're not familiar with the Tuskegee experiments, essentially the government said, we're gonna give this population of Black Americans a vaccination, and it was a placebo, so that they could researchers could examine what the outcome of syphilis looks like clinically. So that carries forth in the minds of Black Americans even today, and may be attributed to the low trust, the low numbers of individuals amongst Black Americans that said they would take the vaccine. This may be attributable to that. So let's look at more broadly across the US, who has responded and how they responded to polls that were conducted by other institutes that looked at a n-value, a number of persons surveyed back in the back earlier this year in September 1700 and December 1600, and said they would get the vaccine. And these are percentages, right? So the percentages of individuals that said they would get the vaccine, we're looking at 63% versus 71%. An upward trend, which is good. And if we look at the individuals who said they would not get it, 34% versus 27%. And there's different levels of their response in terms of definitely or probably, but we want to focus in on the cumulative or the net number in this regard. So when we talk about then, what does that mean for a preventative strategy? We have to look at and go back to our R naught, that reproductive rate. We want to talk about the number of people who have said they're not going to get the vaccine in the population, and anticipate what the number should be for herd immunity in the US in order to keep the majority, if not all, the US safe from COVID-19. In other words, when can we return to normal because everyone has protection as a result of herd immunity, whether natural or acquired? And so if we examine and update ourselves on and refresh on the reproductive rate or not, the low number, if we look at national averages, is about 1.8, 1.75. If we look to and recall some of the data we presented months ago, an R naught value in some states is about 2.5. And in New York and Florida early on, we saw R naught values of high as 5, right? And so we want to look at these key numbers in terms of R naughts to estimate where we are or where we need to be for herd immunity. If we're talking 1.8, it's just over 40% of the population needs to be immunized or have immunity to COVID-19. If we're talking 2.5 R naught, it's 60%. 5 R naught is 80%. So those are our thresholds that we want to hold in our memory because they're going to be important in terms of trying to estimate what our strategy is going to be for the workforce and for how long that strategy needs to be in place until we reach, again, some level of normalcy as a result of vaccinations and also natural immunity from COVID-19. So let's get into those numbers. The effect on the workplace in regards to our strategy is distilled down to one number, our population, 328.2 million people in the US. And if we look at this number and we break it down then, and this is me prognosticating once again, you've heard me prognosticate a couple times around the vaccine and the timeline, and we were spot on in terms of that perspective. Now we want to look to, again, what the future may hold for us in our workforce in terms of how long we need to keep a protective strategy the way it is today in place. So let's start with that number. 328.2 million individuals in the US. And we go to the next level, age 16 or older. Why that number? Because the Pfizer vaccine is indicated for only those 16 or older. All right. As we have new vaccines come and get approved, they may have a similar profile like Moderna for 16 and older, but AstraZeneca may have a different indication because those 55 and older, as we spoke to before, were not included in the study and may not be receiving initially that particular vaccination. But let's move forward with the assumption 16 and older are eligible to receive the vaccine that's in play right now, which is Pfizer. The next level then is we need to estimate the percentage of individuals that say, look, even if available, I'm not going to get vaccinated. I'll wait till later and/or I just won't get vaccinated at all. So let's assume, based upon the data we reviewed, that number, if the polls are accurate, is around 40%. Is that the high number? No. Is that the lowest number? No, it's about middle row. So we'll cut it in the middle and assume 40% will not get vaccinated. And then we move on to then the total number estimated people that will get vaccinated by fall of next year. This is given that logistically things go perfectly, right? We have good distribution of the vaccine, we have great administration of the vaccine, and we have the means to address 147.7 million individuals here in the US, around 45%, okay? Keep doubling down here as we continue this journey through basic arithmetic on the vaccine and the impact to our workforce strategy. The population that is estimated to have natural immunity as a result of COVID-19 begins with the number that currently is infected, right? If we look at that number, we're talking 16.3 million individuals in the US, about 5%. And we know based upon the trends that we've been reviewing that we're woefully underestimating the burden of illness in the US. So let's multiply this number by a factor of underestimation. Let's call it 3x. In some states, we've seen it as high as 8x. If we average it out, we're probably around 2.5 to 3x below what the actual number of prevalence is in the US. So we're going to add that to our assumptions here that 15% or roughly 49% or excuse me, 49 million individuals will have natural immunity, develop natural immunity to COVID-19 because of recovery from infection. All right, so let's add it all up here and get a picture of where we'll be by next fall, 2021. The number we need for herd immunity is that 60%. Again, we're cutting that number in the middle. It's not the lowest. And when we talk about that 1.8 number, it's not the highest at that 5 number for the R naught. So 196 million individuals, almost 197 million individuals will need to have herd immunity here in the US to protect the majority. Where will we be? If we add these numbers together based upon these assumptions, we're right there. 196.5, or excuse me, 196.65, which is roughly that 60%, if we assume that we're underestimating, again, the true prevalence of illness in the US. So that gives us a general picture of can we get there, when we're going to get there, and if we have logistically things go well. On the demand side, we have supply go well, we can reach a level that is commensurate with protecting the majority of Americans by next fall, late next year, perhaps into the winter if we have hiccups. So what does that mean for our strategy? That means we have to develop and continue to develop messaging for our workforce so that we, one, weather the storm through most of next year in regards to the social distancing, the mask wearing, the hand hygiene, because it will need to be in place in the workplace, even if you have a small subsegmented population that receives the vaccine. The recommendation is still keep these measures in place. If we continue to hopefully communicate a message of what we see leadership doing in the US, that will help hopefully bolster support for individuals, increase that number percentage-wise of individuals responding positively to the opportunity to vaccinate. And we want leadership and companies to do the same, right? So if you have an opportunity to hit the C-suite with the message of, hey, are you planning to get vaccinated? And if so, can we put that in a medium that we can share with our workforce? That's going to lead to hopefully a swell of goodwill and a swell of reassurance to our workforce that the vaccine is safe and the vaccine should be taken if given and made available, right? Just as a side note, I'm scheduled for my vaccination next Monday. So we'll be talking about that and my anecdotal experience with it on this next Wednesday, the Wednesday prior to Christmas here. So if we look at the media, and we have to continue to message because we know people will see the response of media to adverse events from the vaccine that's being administered both in Britain as well as the US in this case. In this case, Alaska healthcare worker had an anaphylactic reaction similar to what we saw in Great Britain with the 2 healthcare workers there. And that anaphylactic reaction caused the hospitalization of the individual. They're doing okay according to sources. However, this messaging is going to be something that's prominent in the media, and individuals will see it. And if I can say it no other way, they're going to freak out, right? And so what we want to communicate to them is that, hey, look, this happens, and this happens, as you recall, we presented last week, even to people who did not receive the vaccine. As the Pfizer study showed, 0.4% of people received placebo still had an immediate adverse event within 30 minutes of receiving their shot of saline. So this certainly falls in terms of occurrence of individuals having these responses, these anaphylactic responses to the vaccine within this parameter we see with placebo as well. So this message, again, reinforce it, let people know the safety profile still holds up regardless of what you're seeing in the media around these one-off cases, because the numbers are there. Remind individuals also, do not conflate antivirals, in this case a vaccine, together, because they're not all the same. They need to be differentiated. If we point back to African-American polling in the US, more than 60%, I believe it was actually 80% of African Americans polled believed that they could, in fact, develop COVID-19 as a result of a COVID vaccine, right? And so that is a clear misnomer for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. Because they are not live attenuated vaccines. So we need to make sure our messaging is thorough, succinct, but accurate to the COVID-19 vaccine. And so the question still looms, right? Can employers require COVID-19 vaccination? And the answer to that straightforward is yes, based upon legal reviews by several prominent lawyers, as well as the logic that follows as a result, right? So what are we talking about and referring to? We're referring to the notion that has been put forward already by EEOC and ADA that employers have a legal ability, right, grounding to stand on to require screening back in the spring and summer of this year for COVID-19. Right, actual testing. When I say screening, actual testing, and so that logic continues as opined by, in this case, a legal counsel Hartstein, that employers also have the ability to require COVID-19 vaccinations as a result of an individual's employment, meaning that they can require on a grounds of dismissal if someone refuses and use that as legal substance for that dismissal, right? And again, this all goes back to what EEOC has said around this pandemic and around other pandemics. If we look back to smallpox, H1N1, swine flu, et cetera, there is leeway there to allow employers to legally require vaccinations. Now, the question again falls from that, should you? Right? And that's an individual corporate stance that will need to be addressed with your own legal counsel. However, we believe there will be a necessary threshold that we may cross if we have a number of people that do not step forward to receive the vaccine in order to reach that herd immunity that we saw and presented here moments ago. So quickly in your minds, hold these 3 M's to prepare for the vaccine in the workplace. The first M is messaging, right? What do we say to employees? Make sure you have that strategy locked in. Second is means. How are we going to provide to the employees the vaccine itself and administer it? And then finally, management. How are we going to track compliance with administration? And these are all things that partnering with your local health department, partnering with your local clinical providers, WorkCare included in that, will be a strategy that allows us to address vaccinations across the board. Hopefully, when the demand is there to warrant requiring, or excuse me, if the demand is not there, warranting requiring the vaccine in that partnership would be beneficial in regards to having that clinical support to communicate and hopefully allay concerns of your workforce as we move forward through this pandemic. So with that, we'll wrap up. We'll give you a teaser for next week as we celebrate. Many are celebrating, right, their respective holidays, the birth of baby Jesus. We're going to talk about the births that are not happening, estimated to not happen this year as a result of COVID-19. And we'll talk about a number of other things. Next week will be more of a potpourri of different topics, one of them being the baby bust that's estimated almost 500,000 fewer births in this year as a result, looking back to other pandemics and their effects on population sizes and births. So with that, we'll stop. We'll start with questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. So that's a good segue into the first set of questions, which are about erectile dysfunction. One of them is, could you discuss age-relatedness or the percentage of cases that have involved observations of what you called COVID penis?
Sure. So erectile dysfunction as a result of COVID-19 has not been enumerated in terms of numbers in any study that I've seen thus far, right? We've seen cases obviously reported in the literature, but a true number, a true estimate, I can't give you today because I haven't seen that number as the research continues, hopefully we'll have a broader understanding of the true impact of erectile dysfunction as a result of COVID.
Are you aware of any adverse effects in that regard by anyone who's had the vaccine?
Thus far, since the vaccine is new in its administration, we haven't seen that yet. Correct. So it because of the vaccine not causing the same strong immunologic response, one would not anticipate the inevitability of an erectile dysfunction adverse event. So we'll see. In the clinical trials, it was not one of the prominent adverse events that was documented. So the Harris answer is we don't anticipate it. However, we want to point to some specific objective data as it's presented and researched in the weeks to come after initiating the vaccines across the board.
Okay, great. So some of these questions we've answered before, but probably they bear repeating, especially for those who might have missed those sessions. And I do want to remind everyone, any questions that have been answered in the past, you can find on our website in the Q&A sheets. But the questions are, can you comment in general on efficacy of the vaccine? How does the Pfizer vaccine differ from the Moderna vaccine? How long does immunity last? And does it address, how many strains of the virus does it address, considering there's been so many different strains discovered and that it's mutating?
All right, that was about a 6-part question there. So we'll see if we can tackle each one of them. Efficacy-wise, both Pfizer and Moderna are similar, 90 to 94 to 95% efficacy. That's after the second dose, both vaccines in the clinical studies, phase 3 clinical trials. In regards to the latter part of that, is there any documentation?
The immunity that's afforded. That's the
Correct.
Next part of the question.
Oh, okay, we'll go in order here. All right, so the immunity that's imparted by the vaccine itself has been shown to be similar to natural immunity, meaning you get vaccinated, you have the same level of immunity, similar level of immunity to someone who recovered from COVID-19. The duration of that immunity, no one still ultimately knows the right answer. However, there are studies to show that individuals who have recovered from COVID-19 may have immunity for up to 8 months now. If you look at specific cells called memory B cells that are primed to attack COVID-19 once you're exposed to it again. So it can be as long as 8 months, and that is what's anticipated optimistically for the vaccine as well. However, we're seeing reinfections that are occurring within a 6-month time, and in some cases within a 90-day time period, and those numbers are actually growing. Are they substantial? Not as of yet, but as we continue to weather this pandemic, we're likely to see that number of reinfections during that time period in which we once thought immunity was maintained to present themselves.
Okay, let's see, we have so many questions, I'm just trying to choose. There's one about epidemiology that we could address. Many epidemiologists I work with have some major concerns with PCR reliability, so this is jumping back to testing, not vaccine related. When PCR is amplified over 34 times, it has a 100% false positive rate unless it is performed between the 3rd and 5th day after the first day of symptoms. Can you explain why we would continue to refer to PCR as the gold standard?
Sure. PCR has been the gold standard because it is the most accurate technology that we've had to combat COVID-19 thus far. So the gold standard does not mean perfect. It just means it's the best we got at the time in which we're trying to capture a sense of who's positive, the prevalence of positive, and track incidence over time. The antigen test, woefully short of, particularly early on, woefully short of the accuracy compared to PCR, as well as the serologic test looking at immunogenicity or immunocompetence. So PCR was the best, still right now is the best, and that's why it's the gold standard. Not because it's perfect, but because it's what we have to work with.
Regarding the newly announced take-home test, the test you can just do yourself at home and get an almost instant result, what impact do you think that's going to have on testing that's lab-based and the rate of potential false negative or false positive results? I know it just came on the market yesterday, so I thought, you might want to just get into how it could be effective as a workplace tool or not, depending on your opinion.
Sure. So if we go back to data that was published by Columbia University and their modeling of COVID-19 workplace transmissions and how best to combat it, it was frequent testing and even testing every day, 5 days a week, to help knock down workplace transmissions almost to zero, right? Testing once a week had an effect, testing 3 times a week had a greater effect. So as we look to solutions that allow us to more frequently test in a convenient manner, such as home collection, we anticipate a greater understanding of true prevalence of COVID-19, not just workplace-based, but in the community, as well as a substantial impact to decrease risk for transmission in the workplace based upon those models that were developed early in the pandemic and have since been upheld through objective data that has come from several industries, such as the media industry, in which they're testing 3 times a week to prevent cases of COVID-19 transmissions in that workplace setting. In terms of impact to PCR testing and the market of PCR testing, it will likely decrease that market very little, because as you saw, we're only testing between 1.2 and 1.6 million people in the US on a 7-day rolling average. That number, in order to more accurately articulate the burden of illness, needs to be far higher, orders of magnitudes higher. The numbers that were predicted, right, 12 million tests a day by the administration back in the spring is where we need to live in order to get to a true sense of prevalence and to get close to what we saw and with the data of seropositivity retrospectively.
Let's take one more question. We're out of time after that. This would apply not to industry that's mentioned in the question, but kind of across the board for those with essential workers. The question is, we're in the wastewater treatment industry, thus essential services. How do we get our employees prioritized for vaccinations?
Sure. So if you are in the essential worker, critical worker, designated market, if you would, then it's a state-by-state first determination, but also you fall into that 1B category, meaning that first, 1A is the healthcare workers frontline and the long-term living care facility individuals, and followed by the essential workforce. And then there's 1C as well. And that designation hopefully will mesh well with the strategy each state is taking. And again, it's a fragmented state-by-state determination in terms of allocation. But again, your allocation, if that state follows CDC recommendations, would come secondary in this second tranche of vaccine distributions. So work locally with your public health department, state health department, and that should give you the best opportunity to get on the second tranche of vaccine distribution.
Okay, that concludes our session for today. I'm looking forward to our potpourri topic next week. I think it'd be fun to have a pre-holiday potluck. And thank you all for joining us. Stay home, be safe, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, Dr. Harris.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining. We'll see you next time, same time. Take care. God bless.